everyone. Welcome to the Tipi. My name is Emilie Grenier. I am currently involved in an MA in a program called Textile Futures at Central St. Martin's in London. But I'm specifically here to showcase the portfolio of the work that I do under the label Comme des machines, which means like machines. I am French, so sometimes my brain connects sentences in a bizarre way. Please interrupt me if ever you don't understand anything. And I will try to be as clear as possible. I will tell you about 10 different projects that showcase technologies and craft in different ways, and in the creation of compelling objects and experiences. So there'll be quite a huge éventail of work. Please bear with me. I come from a family of storytellers, and my father, specifically as a filmmaker, taught me from a very young age to interpret the world as if I were directing it, which I interpreted as be a storyteller and be the narrator of the stories that the world has to tell and that you have in your head. So I started by taking a lot of disastrous theatre lessons, and then found a better calling doing a BA in comparative literature and film theory, where I studied and wrote different scripts and more traditional A to B or A to Z narratives, and then went on to doing a first MA in technology and film, where I was interested in the relationship between the new technologies, between the electronic components, and the way that we receive film stories, the way that the cinematic could be maybe taken out of a traditional movie theater experience where we sit in the dark and we receive the story, but how these new technologies might empower the cinematic outside of this black box and into our daily lives. So this is the first piece that I created under the Comme des machines label, and it's actually a piece of wearable technology. So for a storyteller and someone with a tiny bit of a craft background, technology and components are quite daunting and quite ugly as well. And so I decided to hide them all, and you'll see the circuit later. But actually, so I've designed a little capelet, and the capelet hides all the bits and pieces of technology that I use to tell my story. So I decided that when one would come out of the film theater, the traditional film theater space, that the world should replace the screen, and so that our eyes and the world that we see, the actual daily life around us, should become the screen and the action in our movie. I wrote a semi-traditional film script, but instead of writing an A to Z scenario, I wrote an A, B, C, D, kind of a scenario that was in different components that might be randomized. I decided that the user should become the remote control in this experience, and so not only use their own eyes as the screen, but use their bodies as the remote control in telling the story. So I hacked an iPod, and you can see that this was my first experience in electronics, and I had kind of no idea. And there are amazing communities online where you can read and learn and ask questions, and so that's kind of how I did it. But my very first attempt at making a circuit was cutting it out in brown cardboard and trying to understand the different links between the different components, and then moved it on to a soft circuit. So you can build circuits with the traditional wires, the electronic wires, or electric wires, but I chose an e-textile. So it's a conductive textile, and you just cut strips and connect the components at the right spaces. So what I did is I recorded my non-linear script, and this is the most complicated project. I promise after this it'll be much easier to understand. So I recorded my project, I recorded the script, and it was a kind of a soundtrack of a film, if you will, and cut it up in tiny bits and pieces, put it into this hacked iPod, and then put the circuit inside the capelet, where the user would then wear walk outdoors, and their body, there was a little accelerometer and a compass. So it would, so the circuit would actually read the user's gait. And when they were walking, depending on if they were running or if they were walking in a crowd, moving their shoulders quite fast, or if they were strolling in a park in a quite linear way, then the script would be triggered by these different actions that the user was doing. So these are the different bits and pieces that allowed this concept to live. And this was, as I said, part of a first MA, trying to see how we could create these cinematic experiences. And my first kind of encounter with these different bits and bobs, which was a bit of a scary one, but which I learned from. And I was later commissioned to take out all of the scary bits and offer a product idea, actually, that was based on this first experiment. And so the sound scarf was based around the idea of this cocoon, which the capelet introduced, but the movement in the cocoon. And so it's a scarf in which there's a little pocket. You can see there's a little pocket for your iPod or your iPhone, and you would put that in there, and the wires, the different earbuds, were connected from the iPod into the scarf, and then you can put them very delicately, almost hidden, in your ears. And so you would have this experience. You know, you're just listening to your favorite tracks, and hopefully you could also download my soundtrack from the previous piece. But you could just have your experience using technology that is part of your daily life that you know, and you know how to control. So no more accelerometers and compasses sewn almost onto your body, but actually just the things that you know how to use. This brought me to hook up, if you will, with a wonderful artist collective called Circumstance. And we create together cinematic experiences in the daily world, in the world. So outside, again, of the more traditional ways in which the cinematic is delivered to us. But the idea that sound and that headphones and that kind of headspace that we have can allow for true moments of poetry, and how technology, but again, this is an electronic-less bit of technology, but we create these experiences that we've called subtle mobs. And a subtle mob is basically a rendezvous. So you would buy a ticket and to a subtle mob, and receive an MP3 to download, and receive a rendezvous, receive a point in your city where you should be at a specific time, and press play. Around you are anonymous crowds. You might be in a train station, you might be in a square that you know, and you see people with headphones, but you actually have no idea if they're taking part or not, because people wear headphones in cities every day. And we write these quite intricate scripts, and different characters meet and intersect during their journeys. So you have, for example, a 45-minute soundtrack that is comprised of a narrative and instructions and beautiful music that really takes you into a world, and your character might be instructed to write a note and pass it on to someone who is alone, who has their back leaning against a wall, and which was the instruction for their character. And so they're put in a position to receive, and you're put in a position to give. And so you create these moments, and you might look around you, and for a fleeting few seconds, you might see 15, 100 people passing notes, and then it all disappears, and the crowd is anonymous again. And so you have these moments of this narrative coming in and out of these experiences. And this, again, is done with technology that people bring with them. It's not a scary electronic component and something that might break and that might cause frustration. It's your own device, and you press play, and you go into the world. We do these types of experiences now. Last year we were invited, this is at the Barbican, but we've created these orchestras, these symphonies for speaker boxes, actually. So instead of having the world inside your head and your cocoon-like experience of the narrative, you are walking around, and these were for 40 speakers, and you are walking around with one bit of a symphony, with one track of a symphony. And the first time this was actually commissioned to do in Cambridge, and we had 4 different groups leaving different spots in the city and meeting up. And so you'd go from the power of 10 speakers to 20 and 40, and it's just creating these woven connections of, in this case, music within cities and spaces. And this one was done at the Barbican in London. If you've ever seen it or been there, you know how labyrinthine it can be and how interesting it was. It's basically a guided tour where you are the music. This passion, this is quite a leap, but this passion for interwoven narratives has taken me to a few different, and this is where craft perhaps comes back a little bit into the types of experiences that I'm interested in. But I've always been quite passionate, bordering on the obsessed with lace. And I, am a storyteller. I write narratives. My background is these types of experiences, like the circumstance experiences, like the capelet and cocoon experiences. But traditional crafts, like the beautiful objects that surround us here, always interested me, but I didn't have the resources around me to learn from the ground up and to learn this new skill set. So I decided to take my glue gun, which is a tool that is part of my daily practice. It's not a scary tool, it's a tool that I know how to use. And I decided to start tracing the patterns of the lace doilies. I have an antique lace doily collection, and I started making these patterns to better understand how the threads connected. Which took me to this project. So the first glue gun stuff is more experimental, and I always start from a prototype, which might be, in the case of the very first project I showed you, quite difficult, or very easy prototypes like the glue gun lace one, but which brought me back to my screen and back to software, where I actually took an existing piece of lace and mapped it in my computer using generative software and actually played with the knots. I created like a remote control, a panel in which you can expand bits, you can expand the connections. It's just playing with the math of lace, but allowing the computer to work the algorithms and not, again, the craft skill or the hands, because I didn't have that skill set. So these are some of the patterns that were created. And it was important for me to, again, bring it back to the physical world and the world of products. And so when I first moved to London, I discovered barber coats. And I bought a few barbers quite cheaply from Brick Lane Market and decided that they were such a fantastic, not only item, but material to work with. And I decided to laser cut the patterns that were generated by the software onto these barber coats. And so I've created basically lace handkerchiefs, but that were made with technology, a technology-empowered brain. And so this is the outer lining. And this is the flannel bit of the barbers. So I, have the coats that are hanging at home, and you can just imagine the actual square bit missing in the back. So it also renders the coat a bit more fragile and delicate, and a bit useless in a thunderstorm. And then you have these beautiful handkerchiefs, which are equally as useless. But kind of items that are, from the glue gun lace to the computer and back into the world of products. But this was my homage to Britishness. And from Britishness to Canadian winters. The winter quilts were a project that I did with a wonderful artist called Muna Andraus in Montreal. She was commissioned to work on this series of 3 different electronic quilts. So this is when the scary bits from the beginning come back. So 3 quilts, we developed 3 different quilts. Then you can see they were quite giant and they were hung outside a building in Montreal in the dead of winter. So the first quilt that you can see on the bottom image on the left is actually a light quilt. So if it is not plugged in, the quilt has electroluminescent inks. It has inks that react, thermochromic inks actually, that react to the cold. So when you take the quilts outside, the quilt brightens up with patterns of migrating birds. And actually when the quilt is plugged in, the lights come in. And so it's kind of a day to night effect where in the sun, these birds take flight. And then once the sun comes down, you have the strips that allow you to kind of still have a connection with the quilts. And the second one that's right next to it is a sound quilt. So there are, you can see it better actually on this picture, the dots are actually speakers. So in the same way that for the first capelet that I showed you, the same way that I wrote scripts for that piece, scripts were written, but when I say scripts, they're soundscapes basically. So they're meant to trigger moods and emotions and a bit of poetry in the world, like I was saying. And so these are sounds that would be comforting in winter. So we recorded them in forests, and we recorded a walker's gait on the snow and a crackling fire. So they were all sounds that you might hear when you get close to the quilt, actually. And so you have the light that brings you in, and you have the sound that helps in muffling, your experience of the -30-degree dead winter. And the last quilt was for a bit of warming up. And you can see at the top there are giant mittens that are meant to go over your own mittens. And it was in the spirit of Heidi's not tap and pay, but the high five. And they were about clapping your hands and high-fiving your buddy. And there was a counter, you can see in the middle photo, there's a counter actually, and we wanted each time that the quilts were displayed, we wanted to kind of trigger this contest between cities where, Montreal got 2,000 hits, and so Quebec City got only 500, and who's the most active and playful city in the end. And the quilts were actually presented like this. This was the way to travel with the quilts and to bring them from point A to point B. They're like giant sleeping bags or sausages. And they sit on a luge. I'm not sure if that's the right word. It's the thing to slide down a mountain. It's made out of wood. Sledge, thank you. It's the French brain, sorry. And the sledge was actually equipped with a giant solar panel that would power the quilts so that they would be autonomous. From one solar to another, this is a piece of jewelry actually that I created with Muna again under the label Electronic Crafts. So under this label, we are questioning how DIY, kind of do-it-yourself, this maker's revolution and the do-it-yourself technologies might help in creating objects, but again, that tell compelling stories and that come not only in a pretty box, but with a narrative that might make you value it more, value your object more. So this is actually a necklace that is made out of tiny solar cells, and the way that the necklace is designed, it's an actual working circuit. It will not power anything, but because it's so small in voltage, but it might be hooked up to another series of solar panels. And in that sense, the idea was that you carry the potential of electricity, and it was the potential for wealth, and that's why the project is called Solar Gold, where energy might be of tremendous value in the future. Almost done. Electrical weave structures, again, plays on this idea of the potential of things and technology, not just to create a product that is wrapped up and tied with a bow, but actually just designing these quick ideas in the spirit of the glue gun lace or the sound scarves, just realizing the potential of things. So this is traditional electronic jacquard weaving, but where magnet wire, so copper wire, was introduced to think about the potential of creating soft circuits within a woven piece of jacquard cloth. So creating, for now, it's not smart. It's not a smart fabric. It's a conductive fabric. But I sat with weavers and developed the different types of weave structures that could be used, and in that sense, eventually when the components, because for now it would be a bit awkward because components, as you've seen before, are quite big and they're quite tricky to sew on, and which is why I hid them in the first project. They're not so aesthetically pleasing. And they don't allow you to have a uniform pattern. So the idea was to introduce the magnet wire, and when components are soft enough and they can be delicately woven into the patterns as well, then you have a truly smart fabric that can become a supple object. This is all being researched at the MIT. This exists already in different ways. You have soft lights and everything, but this was a crafts sitting on a bench with a weaver trying to understand from a maker's perspective, from, again, a do-it-yourself, buy these components online and sit in your atelier, in your studio, and try to make sense of them. The last piece is called Sixes for Blossom, and it's a word clock. So we created stream of consciousness style. This again is with Muna Andraus in Montreal. And this is how to tell stream of consciousness, like bits of stories, but through light and technology. So it's an 8-foot by 8-foot clock, so it's quite as big like this screen. And the first stream of words is for the hours, represents the hours. The middle bit is the minutes, and the bottom is for the seconds. So you have kind of endless stream of consciousness bits of stories, and you're just you can be entranced in the poetry of it. It was exhibited in a gallery, and there was a massive window, and you can see the clock through the window, and it was, again, winter. It must be always winter in Canada. And you just had people kind of standing there and reading these bits of poetry that shift every second. And so it's not, again, about the function of technology for objects, but it's about these bits of poetry that are allowed to enter the world. Voila.